Good day, everyone. Thanks for joining the ICLEI City Resilience Stories webinar series. Today's webinar is applying the principles of resilience building and DRR for the unexpected. As you know, the COVID-19 crisis has been a lesson for many cities about planning for the unexpected. This webinar will showcase Australian cities which have been dealing with multiple disasters in the last months, from wildfires, flooding, and the recent coronavirus pandemic. This webinar is co-organized by ICLEI and the UNDRR GETI, and I'm now giving the floor to Sanjaya Bhatia, head of the UNDRR Office for Northeast Asia Global Education and Training Institute. The floor is yours, Sanjaya. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Victoria, and welcome everyone to this webinar. The unexpected is what we are all facing today, and probably for a long time now. And uncertainty is becoming the new normal. So this is a very apt session. Today we have very good speakers, all practitioners who have been busy dealing with unexpected situations in the past, and then they will reflect on how this can provide some learning to the present situation. My name is Sanjaya. I'm the head of the UNDRR Global Education Training Institute in Incheon, which is also the global coordinating office for the Making Cities Resilient campaign, which some of you may know of, and ICLEI is a core partner of. So without further ado, let me introduce Sue Campbell. She's the Disaster Management Resilience Officer for the Cairns Regional Council. Cairns is a role model city in the Making Cities Resilient campaign. And Sue has been involved in various events, what we call disasters, and also emergency situations, and will reflect on that experience. So Sue, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. I hope everybody can see the lovely picture before you of what Cairns usually looks like. So for those who don't know the location, we're a beautiful tropical resort that features, of course, the Great Barrier Reef and two World Heritage Areas coming together. And so whilst it's known as paradise, all is obviously not always well in paradise. And we've had many examples of where this has not been true. And I'll talk a little bit about those experiences as we go through. So despite the way things look, we have a very complex socioeconomic makeup, which comprises many cultures. So that's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, as well as many refugee migrant communities. And when I say both ends of the economic spectrum, I really do mean both ends. So enormous riches here and people with lots of assets and beautiful homes, to many homeless people as well. And we have a highly transient population for many reasons. So not many people that were born here stay here, and people do come and go. Obviously, hundreds of thousands usually of tourists, and very limited employment opportunities amongst all that. So very, very heavily tourism reliant in the economy, and only sort of limited numbers of other major employers, of which Cairns Regional Council is one. We also have a lot of very different communities spread from north to south. So although the region of itself is not that large, with about 165,000 normal residents, one location to another can be quite different, even if they're both beaches that are together or both more rural areas. We're also very natural disaster prone, and so as Sanjaya mentioned, pretty much every natural hazard under the sun falls within our considerations. So cyclones, storm surges that accompany those, flash floods rather than slow onset, tsunami, landslips, bushfires. So with changing climate, fire is becoming more of an issue. Earthquakes as well are always potential, and in the last 2 summers, we have had the first official heat waves in Cairns. So although people say that it's always hot here, and compared to many places, it obviously is always hot here, these were temperatures that were previously unprecedented and have had significant effects on both people and the environment in the region. Apart from that, though, we have had no major disasters since Tropical Cyclone Yassi in 2011. And this has led to the sort of spring up of many sort of urban myths and old beliefs. So amongst these, there's the common statement that cyclones don't happen here anymore. Cyclones bounce off the mountains, cyclones bounce off the mountains and move south. And our favourite one is that we can't possibly have a tsunami in Cairns because of the Great Barrier Reef. So the longer we go without one of these disasters, the more these myths abound. And in my work, which is full-time resilience building and development, complacency is the enemy. So we're constantly trying to keep people aware and be prepared for things that in successive years have not happened. The other thing that doesn't help around this is this belief that someone else will take care of it. And so when we question people about this and say, who do you think that someone else is, they find it quite hard to explain what that means, but it's a way of shifting personal responsibility in particular onto some other agency that will miraculously apparently come up with funding and support for these things. So one of the other catch cries in Queensland in particular is that we're a very resilient state and a very resilient place. And when I started this work nearly 9 years ago now, one of my questions was, well, so does saying we're resilient make it so? And how would we actually go about proving and trying to work out how resilient we actually are? I'm just trying to move on to the next slide. Whoops, and it's gone one forward. There we are. So what we did was went through the UNDRR resilience scorecard process and program for Cairns, which for those who have undertaken this, you'll be aware of how rigorous this is in looking through the variety of different indicators of resilience and looking at how those score in different factors at local levels. So what I've shown you on the slide here is what some of the key outcomes were. And I've listed these in particular because they've become really relevant in our current experience of managing the COVID response in the Cairns region. So we discovered that our resilience effort was very strongly led by local government, so that is the council. And although we had degrees of support from state and other organisations, these were not really sufficient to back up our existing and ongoing resilience efforts. We also discovered gaps in process, so where limited risk assessments or around single hazards have been undertaken in the past. We were lacking knowledge of some factors that really contributed to resilience, so for things like insurance levels, both domestic and commercial, lack of information on actual public understanding about how well our information was being received and understood, and looking at other limitations around some infrastructure. So, for example, we had very limited knowledge of emergency fuel supplies. We really didn't understand how well our emergency communications might work. We knew that we had deficiencies with some of our human resourcing for different agencies. We were concerned about the resilience of our ecosystems and how they were contributing particularly to natural disaster recovery and resilience. And interestingly, food. So very little information on food contingencies. And this is something that's obviously played out in the pandemic situation quite graphically. So things like here, not being able to buy toilet paper, not being able to buy flour, not being able to buy sugar, not being able to buy pasta, were things that people had never really entertained having to deal with for more than a few days. And from all of this, we sort of suspected that people were unlikely to do very well managing without for more than a few days. So the outcomes of these things have been built into our regional resilience strategy, which I wrote, called Be Ready Cairns, which really has aimed at, it's in its second iteration now, so we'll be moving into year 6 this year, showed in the pandemic experiences that we just were not ready, communities in general, for the sort of experience we've been going through in recent weeks. So there's been no pandemic here. We've had very, very few cases in the Cairns region, and it's been hard to quantify where those cases sit actually within the local government boundaries, but probably no more than 15 in the entire experience so far. The real challenges have been around misinformation and too much information, so it's been near impossible to establish the truth about what's going on in most situations, and that challenge continues even nearly 2 months into the activation of the disaster declaration here. Mass social effects has been the sort of the first or second major impact in the region. So everything from fear and anxiety to just not being prepared and not knowing what to do, We've had mass job losses in the space of a few weeks, and some really basic needs emerging for people who had never imagined that they'd be without work or without food or without a roof over their heads of some sort, and having to face that reality in a hurry and work out how to deal with it. The second major impact really has been the economic effects for obvious reasons. So in a region that bases its entire economy on tourism, when the tourists stop coming, there's no money. And we had pictures that many people will have seen on TV around the world of people queuing in places like Cairns for relief payments in relief offices. And we're talking people that had never had this experience before and never thought it would happen to them. And a general sort of reluctance to accept that there were going to be restrictions and that people's lives would have to change to adapt to current situations in a world that they'd never really imagined would happen. And it's not something, I have to say, that we'd really prepared people for in our resilience development work as well, although it's very definitely something that we've shown up in working with the scorecard. So in terms of response and recovery, what have we been doing? In this scenario, under the Queensland disaster management arrangements, local councils do not have the lead role as we normally do in a natural disaster. And so we had to work out what our position would be in building both community trust and recovery preparation and supporting other agencies rather than necessarily our own as disaster managers. And the adaptive capacity to the situation was vastly increased very quickly. And so one of my challenges as the disaster coordinator for this event was working out how we put those processes to work when it's not a cyclone, and in this case, not even a pandemic. So looking at what was most critical and being able to respond constructively to that with the resources we had. So what we did in Cairns was establish the Cairns local coronavirus hotline, which was a phone line that ran 7 days a week over 3.5, nearly 4 weeks, for local people to be able to talk about local needs and help us identify what those local needs were through our incident management team and some dedicated liaison cells. And the photo you see there is our working board of human social identified needs around food, accommodation, mental health, and so on. And one of our liaison officers, Sasha, who normally works with multicultural communities on these issues. And using our identified community sectors to come up with the most important issues and the priorities. And the important thing there was that we've got those great networks and contacts already within the disaster management sector and some other areas of Cairns Regional Council. So we were able to draw out those issues fairly quickly and by really strengthening those networks and ensuring communications with them. And then, of course, dealing with that unforeseen situation and learning as quickly as we could from it, and transitioning those learnings into ongoing recovery. So as I mentioned before, it's been a very long time since we've had one of these disasters, and things have changed significantly since 2011 in all sorts of ways. So having to work out what recovery would look like in this sort of situation has been and is an ongoing experience, actually. We're still getting our transition planning for response to recovery together, ensuring that we build that ongoing resilience role into it. And I'm being very keen to ensure that we use the United Nations new public health scorecard process to help us on that road moving into the recovery space. And also, of course, building all of this into our Be Ready Cairns resilience strategy moving forward. So that's a real summary of where we've been at with the situation at the moment, and very happy to take questions later. Thank you.
Thanks, Sue. Before you go, there was one quick question. What is the population in the Cairns region?
A normal population of about 165,000 with an augmentation of over 100,000 tourists on an annual basis.
Thank you, Sue. So with that, and I think very interesting about the urban myths and also the application of the scorecard to pre-identify issues which could crop up later. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Pauline Koritsas she's the General Manager, Business and Community Services at the City of West Torrens in South Australia, with a lot of experience again, especially with the recent bushfires and recovery. So Pauline, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and good afternoon from South Australia. Thank you for the opportunity to share my experiences in Kangaroo Island and the three key factors from those experiences in coordinating statewide local government resources during the recent and devastating bushfires they had there, as well as in Cuddly Creek and the Adelaide Hills, and how they helped us at the City of West Torrens become more resilient to respond and recover with regard in the face of COVID-19. Those three key factors are actually on the screen. Prepare for the worst and hope for the best. Communication, 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 and empowerment, and building building back better the organisation. So within that, I thought I would just explain and provide a little context around where the City of West Torrens is and where Kangaroo Island is for those of you that don't know. The City of West Torrens is a leafy council area that abuts the CBD. It's bounded to the west by the ocean, as you'll see on the slide, hopefully below. It has the River Torrens running through it. It's the Adelaide's main river system. And it has a population of around 60,000. It's an inner metro council area, so we're never really exposed to any major emergencies. We normally have heat waves. It's normal in Adelaide for 45, 47 degree days, weeks on end during summer. And we've had minor flooding. So there's a great level of complacency within not just the organisation, but the community with regard to the need for emergency management. Local government within South Australia has only recently entered the emergency management sphere as a partner or a functional support group with the state government. And in that capacity, the Cuddly Creek fire in December and the Kangaroo Island fires that led into February were the first real formal engagement of local government with the state emergency services in the IMT, the state control centres, etc. And it was in that capacity that I was deployed to Kangaroo Island and Cuddly Creek to help coordinate the statewide local government resources to assist the state agencies and the Australian Defence Force in their firefighting efforts, to support their firefighting efforts. While I was there, I did have some experiences and was very aware that COVID-19 was on the radar. With regard to that, I was on the ferry back. The ferry takes about 30 minutes to get back to the mainland, and gave regard to the fact COVID-19 wasn't really an issue at that point in South Australia or in Australia in and of itself. But I was struck by how the emergency services use data and modelling to help them prepare the island to deal with the fires. Prevention was not something that we could even consider or contemplate at that point. It was more around preparedness. And in preparing, they really looked at saving lives and saving property. And for me, they were preparing to mitigate the impacts of the fires and also strategize on how to mitigate the impacts of those fires. I was also struck by the fact that communication, the massive demand from the community, from the business sector, and from tourists who were still coming to the island during the early stages of the fire, there was a massive reliance and demand on communication in a way I've never really seen before. And also I was struck by the empowerment of the people in the incident management team with their level of empowerment, their ability to make decisions without having to go up the ladder, and using those learnings that they were getting from there to put in place new and innovative ways of trying to deal with not just the fires, but with the community and the demands being placed on them with the community. So in reflecting on that ferry back over, I did a bit of a quick risk assessment with regard to COVID-19, because we could see what was happening around the world. Even though it hadn't really had an impact on Australia at that time, the risk assessment for me was primarily around workforce, the impact on the workforce, and the impact therefore on the services that we provided to the community and to the business sector. That risk assessment indicated that a 40% loss of staff would result in an extreme risk on our ability and our capability to provide services to the community and to businesses. And so when I got back into the office as council commander, I enacted our business continuity plan and our emergency management plan. And in doing that, I enacted the incident management team. And the incident management team, as many of you would know, it's functional leads for particular functions across the organisation that come together to try and manage and coordinate our response and prevention and preparedness for any emergencies. What I did note was that our BCP and emergency management plan didn't really take account of a pandemic or, in fact, human disease. At its own level, the state had indicated to us that human disease wasn't really a big issue for South Australia because of our good health system, our good standard of living, and so forth. So there wasn't any guidance in our BCP or our emergency management plan. So I put together a bit of a project team to start working on an incident management plan. We needed to have some guidance on how, if COVID-19 had an impact on us, how we would deal with it. Remembering at that time, we really had no indication what the propensity was for COVID-19 to affect South Australia, let alone this organisation. And an incident management plan isn't something that sits within our emergency management framework. But the learnings I had from KI indicated to me that we needed to have some plan to work towards to prepare for any eventualities that came from COVID-19, given its significance. I also asked all of the IMT leads and the relevant managers to put together contingency plans. Again, something that's not part of our emergency management framework in local government in South Australia, but rather put together some scenario plans. What would happen if we lost 30% of our workforce because they were ill with COVID-19, or 70%, or even 100%? What would we do if some of our service buildings were locked down as a result of COVID-19? How would we provide critical services to our community, and services that our community rely on to be provided by their council? And those two plans really put us in good stead and help us kind of be a leader in the early stages of COVID-19 in terms of being prepared for it, adapting our services, looking at alternative ways of providing services, looking at moving our staff out of the buildings earlier than we were directed to start doing that. So those two plans really helped us get, as I've said before, ahead of the pack. As part of that, it was also important in my mind that we developed a communications plan, because the community would be looking to us if things turned for the worst, for information about what services we were providing, how were we providing them, where were we providing them, and also an economic development group to look at how could we best support businesses that I knew, the IMT knew, would be significantly affected by a downturn in business as a result of COVID-19. So all of those things together meant we started working early in putting in place our plans, and we knew what we would do and when we would do it if certain triggers occurred. So there were things that we did, such as relocate our service area to a place where staff were protected and the community were protected if they were coming in, and we continue to provide those services throughout and still do face-to-face services throughout COVID-19. We put a lot of our community programs online, such as Tai Chi online, and some of the exercise classes, story time, sing time with the kids. We also moved from a community development model into a community services model, providing packages of food supplies, and we actually started partnering with supermarkets and with food bank to provide hampers and to meet the needs of those vulnerable people within our community. And that was really good. We've never done that before. So we were able to get a bit of a heads up and started putting plans in place to make all of that happen. The communication plan has really worked exceptionally well. Prior to COVID-19, we have 600 likes on our social media pages, and we'd be lucky if we got 1,000 to 2,000 hits per day. As of today, we're hitting 31,000 hits per day for information about COVID-19, and obviously information about our services. This week in South Australia, we turned back on our libraries and community centres, so up to 10 people can come into those facilities, which is great. It's a really, I guess, the start of the recovery process. And finally, the empowerment and building better. One of the keys, as I said, in Kangaroo Island was the empowerment of the people, even at lower levels, to make decisions, and for those decisions, for them to be backed in with regard to those decisions. And so we set that up in this organisation. It was impossible for us to use our normal hierarchical processes for decision making, so we had to free all of that up. And in that, the creativity that came from that, in the way we provided services, in the way that we adapted, we managed to get those that could work from home, all of those, so about 50% of our organisation working from home within a week, which was a massive feat, and we wouldn't have been able to do it if we hadn't done any contingency planning. And those creative initiatives that we developed are going to be the new future. So we are building back better, for want of a better phrase. It's been a really good opportunity for us to look at, is the way we've always done business the way we should be doing business into the future? And the answer to that is no. And part of our recovery plan with the recovery team has been looking at what services can we continue to provide in a contemporary way that meets the needs of the community, and in a way we haven't until COVID-19 came along. So thank you for listening to how my experiences during the Kangaroo Island fires, where I did coordinate those local government resources, actually helped equip the City of West Torrens in the face of COVID-19 to respond, to adapt and to recover in a way that I don't think we would have been able to a year or two ago. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you very much, Pauline. And I think very important point you said, prepare for the worst, because we always do have a bias often when we are planning, and then that can lead to exposure of gaps when the actual crisis happens. So our next speaker is Mr. Stuart McConnell. He is representing the East Gippsland Shire Council in Australia, and he has had a wide range of experience in local and state governments. So Stuart, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. So I'd like to say welcome to sunny East Gippsland, but it's a little bit cloudy today. So, but it's great to be able to share some of this experience with you and talk through some of the learnings and observations in relation to our experience over the last little while with what has been, you know, our part of Australia's really challenging summer with bushfires and how that rolls now into COVID-19 and all of the challenges that brings for communities. I think when we're asked to do this, one of the questions was how do you know, repeated incidents of this kind impact on people's resilience and capacity. And I think one of the fundamental things for me there is part of our recovery from disasters from a social perspective is bringing people together, and the very thing we can't do at the moment. So if I just move on, just a little bit of a snapshot for a moment. So East Gippsland, a rural council in Victoria, just under 10% of the state in terms of area. So it's a big space, sitting in my office in Bairnsdale, you're only halfway to the other end of the Shire. You're just as close to Melbourne. So it's a big place, and a lot of that is public land. Population of about 45,000, 46,000 people. Agriculture, tourism are key things for us, and so things that are very vulnerable to natural disasters. Got a long history of dealing with natural disasters within East Gippsland because it is heavily forested, but there's a particular challenge for us over the last period of time, which has seen not only the fires and then the pandemic, but before that, East Gippsland was sitting in drought for 3 years. So those combinations have created a fair degree of stress within the community. Just to give you a sense of the scale of the fire, so it doesn't exactly show the footprint of East Gippsland as an area, but the vast majority of what you're seeing there is in East Gippsland, and something greater than 70% of the landmass of East Gippsland was burnt as part of these fires, and so it's had quite a massive impact on our community, and that's flowed through into in the order of so it's in the order of between 300 and 350 dwellings that have been destroyed, and all the things that are associated with that in terms of.
Sorry to interrupt you, but the slides are not progressing. Can you try to make it full screen again?
Okay. Did that progress?
Yes, but it's not full screen. If you go down at the bottom.
Yeah, I tried doing that, and then it generated a screen that was not you couldn't see. So I think that might be what we'll need to live with for the moment. I'll see if I can just make that a little bit better. Just a moment.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yep. So I think in terms of the impacts on our communities and the like, very significant impacts. Obviously, a lot of road damage, 600 odd kilometres of roads, nearly 350 houses lost, impacts on our businesses. So that in January we did a survey, and the businesses that were impacted by the fires lost something, particularly tourism, hospitality business, something like 70% of their trade on average. So major impacts in the community in that way. And something in the order of 5,000 kilometres of fencing in farmland that's been lost. So they're major impacts that have been felt right through the community. The major highway through East Gippsland, highway number 1 for Australia, in fact, was closed for 37 days. And so that gives you a sense of the scale of impact and symbolic, I think, in terms of the isolation that was felt by communities through this time, because many of the smaller communities in the forested areas and the like were heavily impacted, and the evacuation of Malakuta as a holiday community was all covered in the media, with thousands of people being evacuated by air and sea by the Defence Forces. So it gives you a sense of the issues that have been there for our community. Yeah, and obviously the photos are showing just the devastation that did occur. I think one of the things about where we are and how we've travelled then with the virus is we know communities go through a whole lot of, and individuals go through a whole lot of phases as they move through the recovery process. And I've borrowed that slide from the Australian Institute of Disaster Resilience, but we know there are challenges, and that after an initial period, people do find increasingly difficult the recovery journey, and that's what we're seeing at the moment. But that's also the time at which for one, you want to bring people together for their support and to provide services and so on. And it's the same time as the COVID restrictions have hit to really impact on that. So I think what we're seeing at the moment is a strong sense from within our communities of concern that they'll be forgotten and increasing the experience of isolation and the like. Some of the things that have been strong in terms of our communities and their response to this is there are some communities who have been through fire many times, and so the notion of this as an event, yep, they know it's a significant event, but the notion of picking themselves up and moving forward is not one that they're concerned by, unless they were very directly impacted by the fires they burnt or similar. There's a lot of members of the community going, yep, okay, well, we know how to manage fires, we know how to recover from fires, and they're doing that. They're in fact almost push back on the notion of recovery and focus on the sense that, yeah, well, this is what we do, we're well connected, we look after each other. And there's others, obviously, other people who have been very directly impacted, who are taking it for whom this is going to be a long journey. I think the question was, do multiple events enhance our resilience? And I think the experience there is where the events are far enough apart that we do get a sense time to recover and learn and prepare, then multiple events can in fact help our recovery, help our resilience. However, in the circumstances where we've had here with the COVID impacts coming so closely on the heels of a major event, that's not how it's working, and they are in fact compounding impacts. And I mentioned before the losses within the business community. Well, those losses in some of those same sectors are repeated now, and so that's a compounding effect. We see different patterns of resilience within different communities, in part depending on how, one is the extent of that impact, but also the extent of the inherent networks and connections within communities to begin with. And those that have had strong networks and connections have been able to find ways to move forward. In terms of the things we've learnt, we know now that we need to put some very significant investment into enhancing the resilience of some of our infrastructure, particularly the road network, telecommunication network and so on, because the isolation issues were so severe in this event. And the other thing that we've been able to learn, I suppose, and carry from one event to the other is we moved very quickly to establish information channels for our community in terms of newsletters and the like, directly focused on recovery issues. And there's nothing magical about another newsletter, but it was incredibly important for our community to get the information flowing in the post-disaster environment, and to be able to pick those things up and continue. That's been important in a COVID environment, as has the flexibility and adaptability of our staff and other teams in responding. And one of the things I do need to recognise is just the huge number of people have contributed to both the relief and response efforts over the summer period from all over the place, and as volunteer and others, and particularly to the local government sector, which certainly came and assisted East Gippsland Shire Council in a huge way. And I think there was approaching 200 staff from other councils across Victoria that came and provided assistance at different times, which was greatly appreciated. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions or similar.
Thank you, Stuart. I think we will go into a round of questions very shortly. But before that, let me introduce the next speaker, especially seeing time. Steve Gawler, he is the Regional Director of ICLEI, based in Australia, and he has worked in a number of local governments in the past. So Steve, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Just checking that you can hear me.
Yes, very clear.
Great, thank you. And look, it was my pleasure to find our three panellists who've been speaking this afternoon. So that's been fascinating. Thank you, Sue. Thank you, Pauline. Thank you, Stuart. What I'd like to do for only a few minutes is just draw out what for me are some of the most interesting threads or principles from the stories that have been told. Because the whole thrust, of course, is how do you prepare for the unexpected when you don't know what the unexpected is? So clearly we need to have some fairly high-level principles that guide us. And one thing, and I'm reflecting a lot on the bushfires because, you know, they were monster fires this year in Australia. Unprecedented, like so many things need to be seem to be unprecedented these days. What did we learn from those? And what are we learning now from the COVID virus? One of the themes raised by everyone is social issues, the need for greater social protection or social welfare, because the most vulnerable people, even before the disasters, are the ones who are then most affected by the disaster. Interesting to hear Sue's comment in Cairns. They had many vulnerable people, recent arrivals, Indigenous communities, homeless, etc. And they're the first ones to be hit by a cyclone or by floods or by a COVID. I've seen recent research done by the United Nations, it might even be by UNDRR, about the impacts of disasters on people in the Pacific. And the biggest point coming out of that was the need for much greater social protection, because the people who are already living in very vulnerable locations are the ones most affected by the next disaster. But I was interested to see in the case of the bushfires, as well as the people being so vulnerable, it was the environment itself. Because there had been extended droughts and heat waves in some of those areas, the forests and the grasslands were drier than they've ever been before. They were already very vulnerable and in very poor health, quite fragile. And when the bushfires came along, of course, and the grass fires, it actually devastated those ecosystems far more than would often happen. So already vulnerable becomes far more vulnerable. The rural community, the farmers, had already been hit very hard by the drought. They were not generating income. They were not spending money in their local towns. So many of the small businesses in the local towns were already on the brink of going under before the fires came. And we've heard from Stuart the incredible impacts on some of the supply lines, you know, the major highways. The lifeline to those towns was cut off by the fires. And so many of those businesses already struggling, this could have been the death knell for them. So vulnerabilities, multiple vulnerabilities, and particularly the need for social protection, I think is a very big area that we need to focus on more to resilience. The second thing I wanted to look at was if we use the Sendai scorecard, the second essential in the Sendai is to know your risks and to do scenario planning for those risks. So thank you, Pauline, for that example of coming back on the ferry from Kangaroo Island, and you're full of the experience of the bushfires and you're applying it to a hypothetical, what would happen if the pandemic came to Adelaide, which of course it won't, because the state government told us it won't. And so you did your risk assessment and you came up with high-level risks. But then you also conducted scenario planning. And one thing I don't think we're good at in this field is scenario planning. Not just saying, okay, it could flood or there might be a virus, but working out what are all the implications of that you need to be ready for. And I'm very struck by the concept of cascading effects. So quite often we focus too much on the initial obvious effects. So bushfires, okay, damage to property and loss of lives. Then you start to drill down and look at the social and the economic impacts, which Stuart spoke about. But then further down, you look at some particular systems which are very fragile. And I noticed with the bushfires, fuel supply was one. Just the ability to top up your car with petrol or diesel, because the landlines of the fuel supplies have been cut. The firefighting effort was consuming huge amounts of fuel. There was fuel being flown in for the firefighting. But when those tourist destinations on the east coast of Australia were told to evacuate, there were queues and queues of cars at the petrol stations trying to fill up, and they couldn't. Clean water was another one. Because the bushfires in some parts of eastern Australia, believe it or not, were followed by flooding rains. And what was happening was runoff from the recently burnt areas was heavily polluting the water storages, and there were concerns even as far away as Sydney of whether the cities would have clean water supplies. So the cascading effects, I think, is something we need to become far smarter at working out. And you do that, I think, by the scenario planning. And my last reflection is, so where does local government fit into this? So interesting, I think it was Sue said local government doesn't have a particularly central role. I think I got that right, in Queensland, and focused quite a lot on more the welfare services, the social support to the community who came to the council because the local government just didn't have that local coverage of services to be able to help. Interesting that Pauline said it's just now that local governments in South Australia had a formal role in the state emergency response apparatus. And so it was great to see the way West Torrens was able to be very proactive. And earlier today, we were talking to a mayor from New Zealand. He made the same comment that in the case of emergencies, it's largely a national government responsibility, and local governments don't really have a formal role. But quite often, end of the day, they're the ones that have to pick up all the pieces. And I noticed with the bushfires in East Gippsland, while most of the planning and action was driven by the state governments, when the TV visited the towns in East Gippsland, who did they want to talk to? They wanted to talk to the mayor, because the mayor spoke on behalf of the people. And that gets right down to, I think, our critical role in being closest to the people, being able to work closely with communities, but also the businesses. So thank you for that. Just a few reflections.
Thank you, Steve. Yes, it is. I think everyone has been talking about, but Pauline said it best: prepare for the worst and hope for the best. So that is what the resilience plans should be based on. So I have a number of questions now, and I'll introduce first two questions and then hand over to the panel for responses, and Victoria will take it further. Firstly, there was one question to Pauline. How long did it take for the council to prepare the plans? So on average, how long it took to develop the plan? But another question which I think anyone from the panel could answer, and which is very important: how much actual deviation did you find or experience from the plan, and what really happened? So, and what is that? What is the learning that you can share from that? So first Pauline, and then any member of the panel. Over.
Thank you. Interestingly enough, it's a good question. It took us about 7 working days to put together the contingency plans and about 9 working days to put together the IMP, remembering that we were working basically flat chat over that period to get these documents ready. Because as we were developing these documents, the risk was becoming more and more real for us, so we knew that we needed to get those documents up and running as soon as we possibly could. Thanks.
And any members of the panel want to talk about the actual deviation that they saw? And also another point was, Steve just talked about cascading. So was natural hazards and pandemic considered in that scenario, together? Over.
I think in Cairns it was considered, but the absolutely devastating effects of something that, as I said, is not really a pandemic here, the social and economic effects, the scale of that really wasn't anything that anybody had prepared for. And in terms of deviating from plans, we had plenty of templates and possible scenarios prepared, but none of them fitted the actual situation that we've been dealing with. And so we've had to continuously adapt our processes at a local government level, working with state and federal governments to fit the local situation.
Also quick, if I could, the question about the pandemic, how it interfaces with other disasters, and I was happy to participate in another of these webinars a couple of weeks back where speakers from countries like the Philippines were speaking about how they're preparing for their annual typhoon season, and how they're very concerned about how to apply the social distancing rules to evacuation centres, because of course that's almost the opposite of social distancing. And they're undertaking some very innovative planning now to basically disperse the evacuation facilities rather than the traditional model of centralised evacuation centres.
It's Stuart McConnell here. I'd echo that. We turned our mind to having just run relief centres for hundreds of people at a time. What would happen if there was a flood, which is usually what happens following the fires in East Gippsland during the COVID period, and certainly came up with a proposal for a kind of more dispersed approach to providing relief support. In terms of plans, I think my experience through the fire period was that the plans that are there provide an initial framework to start from, but in an event of the scale that we were in, we very quickly find ourselves in 3 or 4 weeks of continual problem solving. So whether it's, and also working with people we've never worked with before. So in East Gippsland, we hadn't worked with the Defence Forces before, but they played an absolutely critical role. And so you're continuing to reinvent how you operate to work with groups like that. And just as an illustration, I think at one stage we had 27 communities that were isolated that we were trying to work out how to get relief supplies into those 27 different communities. And that's not been thought of before for us. And so that's the problem solving on the fly.
Thank you. And just with regard to the question about deviation from the plans, in South Australia, the confirmed cases of COVID-19 have been very low, not as low as Cairns, but they're sitting at the moment at 439. We haven't had any of our staff members exposed or confirmed or testing positive with COVID-19. So the workforce reduction hasn't really been, the strategies around that haven't needed to be put in place. Our facilities were closed by state direction. So those actions have been put in place. And as I said, we're now bringing those back online in a staged way.
Okay, thank you. And there is a comment from Jonathan Abrams from WHO that we need to prepare a range of scenarios rather than just not only the worst, but a range of scenarios, including the worst. And I think that does address some of the questions. There was another question on effective ways of engaging the community in the region. So any good examples, both in the crisis situation, but also in the recovery, yeah, that's it. So Pauline, you want to start?
Thank you. We, in our community services department, the department's actually co-located with our main library, and we already have details of the community members that use all of those facilities, particularly the vulnerable ones. So we were able to make contact with them and work with them on what their needs were and how we could address them, which, as I said, resulted in a change in the way we provided some of our services. We also used our social media to engage. We partnered with SA Health and they did share information about vulnerable clients. We were undertaking welfare checks on behalf of SA Health. And we also engaged with the not-for-profit sector, as I said, in a way we didn't before. And so we were able to share information about clients with the client's permission. So we were getting lots of information from the community on how we could best address their needs.
Any other member of the panel?
I guess I think I mentioned it in my presentation, we really relied heavily on a lot of our existing networks for feedback. So these are networks that operate in peacetime as well as in disaster networks, but because we haven't been able obviously to meet in person the way we normally do, a lot of our engagement is very one-on-one. The strength of those networks, I think, was really important in allowing people ongoing access to talk and feel that they had a forum to make their needs known. So whether that was a need for assistance or offers of help that were perhaps not normally available. And the hotline did give us a great appreciation, I think, of ongoing engagement needs from a wide range of community members. So it was a way of hearing from individuals as well as organisations, obviously, about what they needed and how we could actually best support people in an ongoing way, particularly over that sort of critical first response period at a very local level where those options weren't normally available to them.
Anyone else would like to share any other story? Finally, maybe I would like to finally ask to Steve what mechanisms would best apply in order to rise from the crisis of social protection brought by multi-hazards, bushfire and COVID?
Thank you, Victoria. I saw that question. I was hoping I'd be able to adapt this, but I'm not too sure. I probably need to wear my ICLEI hat, and some of the people viewing this may be aware that ICLEI, our mantra is to help cities with long-term sustainable development and resilience building. So we've been working on this for years. We do have a mechanism. We do have what we call a planning cycle, which a city can go through to prepare for the unexpected. We call it an urban resilience planning cycle. And in the light of the COVID, we revisited that, which we'd written it a year or two back and said, well, to what extent would this have been useful for a city if the virus was on the horizon and they wanted to have a systematic way of preparing? And we think it stood up pretty well. It did already have epidemics as one of the potential hazards. We didn't have pandemics. But almost every step was just what we've been talking about today. It's knowing your risks, it's doing the scenario planning, making sure all the right people are in the room or virtually. So there's a whole lot of steps like that. But we plan to be able to make that available very soon. I think that's what you were asking about.
Yes, thank you so much for addressing this topic. And just to close, I just want to thank to all the speakers, Sue, Stuart, Pauline, and also our moderator, Sanjaya, who had to leave a bit earlier. Steve, thank you also for your support. Just to finish, I would like to share with the participants the different resources that we've been collecting through the COVID-19 crisis, which could be useful for local governments and the community in general. And also UNDRR has been collecting some policy briefs and webinars which are available on their website, as well as the prevention website, where you can also find a collection of resources that might be useful for cities and urban practitioners. And finally, I would like to invite all of you to our new initiative in the city of Bonn, the Daring Cities Congress, which will be in the this year global virtual forum for urban leaders taking on the climate emergency, taking place from the 7th till the 28th of October this year. To learn more, please go online and share your interest, and we will be looking forward to welcoming you all there. So if you want to stay tuned and informed on future webinars, and also to have the access to the recording of this webinar and past webinars of the City Resilience Stories webinar series, please check out our website, and we will also reach out to you with all these links. The presentations from the speakers will be also available, and the recording. So we will also make our best to reply to all your questions once you send to the chat. As always, we don't have time enough to go through all of these questions, but we will kindly ask our speakers to take some time to go through them and send some answers to you, and we will put this available as well on the website next to the webinar recording. Thank you very much to everyone, and have a great evening or have a great day wherever you are located, and thanks. See you soon.